I think I think the clay has really stuck really well to this plaster, and you got to keep in mind that this clay's been in here for overnight when, it's dried up, so it's a lot firmer. So as I pulled off the back half, I noticed that the ears were holding it on, and I had to wedge and finagle and squeeze the back half off. And sure enough, there, So we take this clay, what's left on this live cast, and what do? We put it back in our box to soak it again and make another mask some other day. Now this stage separates the men from the boys. Sitting down with a wooden tool, I suggest, and not a metal tool like I sometimes use, like an idiot, but a wooden tool, and we pick the clay out. You also be thankful when you have a clear plastic spray coat on your clay. You'll be thankful at this point because it will come out of the mold easier. We will eventually have to scrub this mold to get some of this debris out, but the major pieces, we just pull them right out. We pull them out using wooden tools. Metal tools, why not? Metal tools, they might scratch the surface. Again, on this sculpture, doesn't make any difference. The back half, doesn't make any difference. We gouge it; it's going to be covered in hair. Doesn't make any difference. But the front half, all the detail and so forth, I try not to screw it up with a metal tool if I can. This plaster is not quite as hard as Ultra Cal 30, but even Ultra Cal 30 can be scratched. So keep that in mind. So now the next thing is to just spritz it with water and scrub with toothbrush. Here I have a ordinary chip brush, a hardware type brush, cheesy thing, cut to like a ½ inch or a ¼ of an inch above the base of the bristles. This makes a great big scrub brush that can get into certain details. You can get a ½ inch one and an inch one, 2 inch one, whatever you want, and you have a whole set of them to work and scrub this clay out. And then I take it out in the backyard and I spray it with a water hose to get the rest of the residue out. I want to try to make it as clean and as white on the inside as possible. Now that's all clean and dried out, we get to have fun. We get to pour rubber. Usually certain things I will, like I'm doing here, I'll sponge in a coat of latex to get every single pore that I sculpted. I've discovered recently there is a kind of a problem with this. You don't get the same thickness you would get normally on the surface using this pouring method and combining it with a sponging on method. I think probably the sponging on method, it holds back some of the moisture in the latex so it doesn't absorb. Let me explain how latex works, and you'll see as I pour here what I'm doing. This is how slip latex works on masks. I've tried other latexes for this many years ago, but I stopped using anything else but something that's been labeled latex, slip latex mask rubber. When you pour in the latex into a mold, a porous mold like the Hydrocal, it creates a film on the inside. It has made its own thickness as soon as you pour it in and rotate it on the inside of the mold. What is going on is the moistures, the ammonias, the waters, they're being pulled and sucked out into the plaster. And there's air, believe it or not, there's air coming through the plaster and gradually drying the latex inside this mold. That's how masks are made. It is a film that is made on the inside. You've seen ceramic things, weird little animals or whatever. Ceramic is done kind of the same way. It's a very porous plaster mold, and the slip material is poured in, and what is left is a skin on the inside of that mold. The rest is poured out. When it's completely set up, it's pulled out, and they call it green at that point, like we call mask green when you first pull them out, and then they fire them and they're completely set. Same thing, technology with masks. We pour up our first layer, a technique I've been working on for the past few months. Pour up a layer, roll it around inside, just, you know, a quart or whatever, roll it around inside, then get some compressed air, and I'll blast the surface where my detail is at. If it's all over, then I'll blast all over to get rid of the bubbles, because there's bubbles that get worked up inside the latex when you pour back and forth, as you'll see. Blast the surface with air, break those bubbles, roll some more latex back over that, let it get its own thickness again, let it get that skim over it naturally again. Sometimes I do a second blast of air and roll it again. You don't have to do that, but I suggest doing it the first time that way. Roll it all over, then I set it down, and then here I pour it up and I fill the mold with latex. Now, some people can't afford to drop $200 for 5 gallons of latex. Usually people can only afford 1 gallon. That's cool. You can pour the entire gallon into the mask and rotate that guy around, hit the surface with air, like I've said, rotate it, whatever, and pour the excess back into the bottle or a bucket or a can, and let that set up for about 20 minutes or so, and let it kind of get a good skin on it, let it get a little less wet. Then you come back and do it again, not blasting the surface. You pour in more and let it rotate around. But with the 5 gallon bucket, which I have here, I fill it all the way up, let it set for about 20 minutes or so, pour it back in the bucket, let it set dripping for 15-20 minutes, something like that. Turn it back upside down, pour in more, let it build up, pour it back, let it sit for 20 minutes, pour it back in the bucket, then let it sit overnight or whatever and let it drip. That builds up a couple of really good layers of skin. Then we let it sit until it's completely gone from green, meaning not ripe, I guess, sort of very white looking, to kind of an off-white. You can feel it. It doesn't look shiny or wet anymore. It's matte. You can touch it, and if it's not squishy, you know, then you can pull that out and let it ripen or turn more amber or golden in the air. It'll set up better or what have you. Now, there's things to be concerned about when you do that. You don't stuff it with newspaper, fill out the shape. It'll warp in the position that you have it in. But this latex is very good. It has a really good memory. If you want, you can leave the entire thing in the mold until it's completely amber. Just whenever, all night, all day, doesn't make a difference. The only problem with that, keep in mind, is that if there is enough latex that is seeped down between the two halves of the mold, then that will be used to grab the mask. The latex of the mask will be grabbed by the two halves of the mold, and when the latex starts to shrink, everything will pull away. The detail and stuff will pull away except this little wall, this little strip here that's between the two halves, and you'll get this deformity that will be made into the latex because it didn't pull away. Everything else did. This weird little ridge that goes all the way around. I've seen it happen a few times. Be careful of that. That's why I take them out while they're still green. So we take it out and we take a look at it. Before we pop off this clamp, I check to see if it's got any wet spots. There's a few little soft spots near the chin. Didn't let it drip right. I powder it. Supposedly, most latexes will stick to themselves. I never really had a problem with the mask latex because there's so much fillers in it. It doesn't really stick to itself, but it's talcum powder. It's cheap. Use it. Showing here that I'm powdering it up really well. And then I open up the mold. I see there's a couple little soft spots. I'll let it sit a little bit more open like this to get more air around it. And then eventually I pull it out. And on this particular pour, I noticed the front half's a little thinner than the back half because I sponged in the front half. Like I said many times before, I've sponged in a layer and gotten every detail that I wanted and never really had a problem. Could have been this was the first pour. Could have been because it was the first pour that the mold was not as dry. Again, you got to remember how this latex works. The moisture is pulled out by the mold. If the mold is brand new, it's just been made, there's still moisture in the mold. So let it dry some more. When I have to do a mold that I really want to keep the sculpture for a long time, I want a really tough mold, I use UltraCal 30, I'll dry it out in the oven for a few hours on a low setting of 175 or so to make it porous and absorb more liquids. I'll dry it out quickly. It's very dense, UltraCal 30. But here, this is a little thin. But as we get real closer, you can see that was pretty much worth it, I think. It's holding its own shape, and it's also got all that texture in there that we put in there. Every little crease and crevice and wrinkle and pore and all that. Now the next step, let's take a look at it. Look at all these great little details in here. Saved. It's been saved. That sculpture spent so much time on, which is the most lengthiest part of making a mask, is sitting there sculpting it. You want to retain all that, so you make sure you do your mold as every step should be as dead on as you can make it, as detailed. Don't try to cut corners if you can't. If you can, try to do each step carefully. But we see here we got every detail that we sculpted in. The next thing is to, for most masks, again, it's not really important for this because it's kind of going to be covered in hair, but we look at our seam, which is not bad here. It's only like 1/4 of an inch around. We cut that off with scissors. Cuts pretty easily. The best are real small, real fine scissors, like for clipping toenails or something. And a toenail clipper can be used, as we'll show, but we cut that off. And if we really wanted to get rid of that detail of a seam, we got a Dremel tool. We come along and we sand that off. And there's a note about the particular plaster I used on this. I wanted it because it was porous and it was very dense, but it's also not real accurate. There is a shrinkage problem. The accuracy is not quite off, so you'll get the back half will not be actually registered that well with the front half. That's why you really should look into UltraCal 30, which has hardly any shrinkage at all. It's very accurate. You're going to have a seam no matter what. No matter how well it's done, you will have some kind of a seam. Maybe tissue thin, but you'll have a seam. That's just the nature of the beast. But the UltraCal 30 is very accurate, very tough. If you want to keep a mask for a long time, UltraCal 30 is great. It takes longer to work with it. It goes slower. It's nicer that way. I use this specifically, this plaster, Hydrocal, because I wanted to go quick. And I knew that this misregistration would not make any difference in the design. It would be covered by hair. Okay? So we run the Dremel over this, trim off this seam, get it as flat as we can. You can do this on all, whatever. I use just an ordinary sanding drum. Take it off. Sanding disc works well too. Works really well, actually. We get it down as small as we can. Trim out the eyes, things like that. Trim out the nostrils. Trim the seam with toenail clippers. Sometimes if you have bubbles on the surface of your plaster and you have a bubble rise up on your latex, you can take these toenail clippers and go in there, pop it right off. You can get into some really weird angles. You can get some really good toenail clippers that have a really good sharp point, get some leverage on that, and you can take them off, bubbles out in the strangest places. It works really well.